There's not one single day that goes by that I don't have Lauren on my mind. To know that I may not experience that type of love again, it hurts me.
He called his name a few times. He didn't answer or respond. And when he touched his ankle, he knew immediately his friend was dead.
Most people want payback because they want to win. They don't want to be in a situation where they come out on the losing end.
She felt like her love outweighed anybody else's love with him. That meant grandmother, children, friends, acquaintances, co-workers. It did not matter.
When a person is hurt, they'll do anything, even take your life.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a little after 1 p.m. on Super Bowl Sunday, and Curtis Peterson is ready to enjoy the game. But strangely, his best friend, Lauren High, still hasn't arrived.
The Patriots are playing the Falcons, and everybody's excited about the day. Lauren was supposed to meet his friends to watch the game. He never made it.
Nobody's heard from him, not a call, not a text, not a peep. And that was very out of character for Lauren, because he wouldn't miss hanging out with his friends and having a good time and watching football.
Then, Curtis gets an alarming message from Lauren's ex-girlfriend, Suzette.
I said, have you heard from him? Is he upset about something? What's going on? I said, this is not like him.
She usually talks to Lauren every day, but all his calls are going to voicemail.
Curtis was concerned. He did know that the anniversary of Lauren's mother's death was approaching. So he didn't know if he was, pulling away or could have possibly committed suicide because of that fact, or if Lauren just had some other things going on.
Around 3 p.m., Curtis decides to go to Lauren's house because he can't get a hold of him. And when he gets there, he's not answering the door.
When he still got no answer after knocking, he decided to break in.
Curtis notices that it is freezing inside the unit. It is in the Midwest in February, so we know that it's going to be cold, but there is an expectation for it to at least be warmer inside the house.
In the living room, what he discovers makes his blood run even colder.
He noticed a pair of feet sticking out from the couch. It was Lauren. His heart dropped. He called his name a few times. He didn't answer or respond.
He walks up to Lauren and touched his leg and realized immediately that he was dead. He went and called 911. He thought that possibly Lauren had killed himself.
Lauren Lavelle High was born on April 20th, 1988. His father left when he was young, so Lauren's mom became his primary parent, assisted by his grandmother.
The relationship Lauren had with his mom, he really, really loved her, admired her, respected her. He was a mama's boy. She taught him, respect for himself and for women and just everybody in general that's around you. His grandmother as well, she didn't play any games with him, and he knew it. He wasn't gonna do anything to disgrace his mother nor his grandmother.
God and family was really the cornerstone of Lauren's life. He was all about his mother and his grandma and just being a really, really good kid.
As a teenager, Lauren's good manners and good looks made him popular with girls at school.
I met him when I was maybe 15 or 16 years old. He had a nice brown coat on, suede. And I said, "Hey, Denzel." He turned around, strode back to me, said, "How are you ladies doing?" And it was just history from there.
Lauren and Kariba were just friends, but very close ones.
He was just a ray of sunshine. He was always energetic. He was always positive. I've never heard negative words really come from his mouth.
When Lauren was 17, his life changed forever. On February 27, 2006, his mother, Daphne, died unexpectedly. She was only 46 years old, and Lauren was devastated.
Lauren never really went into details about how his mother passed away. When he would speak of it, I most definitely get the sense that it was sudden because he didn't have time to prepare. And I know there was a lot of things he wanted to say to her that he never got to say.
That was a tragic event for him. He was never the same after he lost his mom.
I never pressed him about it because, you only get one mother. And the fact that she passed away when he was so young and your father's not around, you don't really have too many people to look up to.
Lauren inherited his family's house, but while most of his peers were getting jobs or going to college, he struggled to find his place in the world.
He was interested in going to the Marine Corps. He took the course, but unfortunately, he went another direction. He actually tried being a firefighter, and that didn't work out.
After bouncing between several jobs, Lauren finally landed as a manager at a local supermarket.
In 2011, he tried settling down with his girlfriend to start a family. The relationship didn't last, but Lauren wound up with 2 beautiful daughters.
Lauren's heart and soul was those little girls. He loved to pray with them, read them stories, prepare them for life.
He would do anything for his girls. He didn't care if he was embarrassing himself, taking silly photos, doing crazy stuff to the hair. Every time I saw him, he was showing me new pictures of them or what they were up to and what they were doing.
In 2014, Lauren found love again with a single mother of 3 named Portia Humphrey.
They both had suffered great loss at early ages. Lauren lost his mother, and Portia lost her father. So they bonded in their grief and their trauma, which really solidified their relationship.
Things were getting serious. They even discussed marriage. But after a year, the relationship fell apart.
You're not going to stay together because of a trauma bond. In toxic relationships, a trauma bond is definitely not enough to keep you together. It actually is pretty much going to be the reason why you break apart.
Then, in 2015, Lauren reunited with an old friend from school, Suzette Bourgeois, and his life took a more positive turn.
Lauren and I really, really got close when my brother Lance was passing from cancer. And I was in college still, working on my last degree, and I had to leave Atlanta and go to Milwaukee because that's where my brother was. He saw me trying to be the person, to make my brother smile in his last few days, but he knew I needed somebody, and he really, really stepped in. Lauren he's most definitely family oriented, and that was the whole reason we connected on a different level, because he wanted, the house with the white picket fence and the dog and the children, and he wanted that family life because he didn't really get a full family life. He's basically ready to make those next steps. He was getting ready to move down south and get away from Milwaukee and, pursue better things.
Lauren and Suzette's romantic connection eventually cooled, but they stayed close. And by early 2017, Lauren's future seemed headed in the right direction. But now, he's been found dead in his living room. Milwaukee police arrive at Lauren's home to find his best friend Curtis waiting. He's in shock and thinks Lauren might have committed suicide due to his mother's passing 11 years ago that month.
There was a lot going on. The anniversary of his mother's death, he could have been depressed.
But the evidence, suggests something else.
When the investigators walked over to the body, Lauren was face down onto the ground. They then rolled him over and they noticed that he had blood all over his shirt and that in fact he had a gunshot wound to the chest. But there was no gun.
The police were able to determine very quickly that this was not a suicide.
So now it's time to investigate what really happened.
"28-year-old Lauren High has been found dead in his Milwaukee home with a single gunshot wound in his chest. So far, the only thing investigators know for sure is that he didn't shoot himself."
The police had more questions than answers. It's cold in the house, the furnace isn't working, the space heaters are toppled over, there is no gun, and there are 2 bullet casings within the home.
The 2 casings recovered are .40 caliber.
So at this point, the detectives are trying to figure out what actually happened to Lauren.
One thing they know, Lauren only has 1 gunshot wound, so the killer shot twice, but only hit once. But who was that killer, and why kill Lauren? More evidence in the living room provides a possible scenario.
They found Lauren's cell phone next to his body, and also a piece of glass with some powdery substance that was sitting on the table.
Was this an instance where there was a drug deal that went bad?
Detectives are able to lift a fingerprint from the glass for analysis. If it isn't Lauren's, it could belong to his killer.
The detectives also sent Lauren's cell phone out to retrieve any potential and relevant and material information that was on the cell phone. The cell phone had a passcode on it, so they had to send it out to a special lab to get that information.
It was so cold in that house that it slowed down the decomposition of Lauren's body. So now we can't nail down an exact time of the killing.
To narrow down the timeline, investigators turn to the man who called 911, Lauren's best friend, Curtis Peterson.
The first person on the scene was Curtis. They wanted to know when was the last time Curtis saw Lauren, the last time Curtis spoke to Lauren.
Curtis then told them that he hadn't heard from him in a couple of days and that even his girlfriend reached out to him about Lauren's whereabouts.
So that is the reason why Curtis went over to Lauren's house to see what was going on.
Curtis swears Lauren never did hard drugs, just smoked an occasional joint. So he can't imagine the powdery substance was Lauren's. They next ask about guns.
Curtis knew that Lauren kept the gun in the house. And when they searched the house, they couldn't find his pistol anywhere.
Lauren could have possibly been killed by his own .40 caliber handgun. And whoever killed Lauren could have possibly taken the gun from the scene.
Police speak to Lauren's neighbors, but no one saw or heard anything suspicious. As investigators continue to gather information, Curtis contacts Lauren's friends to give them the bad news.
I was laying down at the time, and I just told him, what's going on? And he said that Lauren had been found deceased in his home. And he wanted me to hear it from him instead of hearing it from a news outlet or social media. And I just remember sitting up in the bed and I'm like, what? What are you talking about? I drove down to Lauren's residence and I just parked on the side street. And they had everything yellow taped off, and it was lots of police officers and detectives outside. I couldn't believe this was happening. And I eventually got out the car and I walked up to an officer. I I just lost it. I started crying some more, just in shock and disbelief. The detective had asked for my name and, asked for some information if I knew anything. I didn't know anything. I was just as surprised as anyone, and I was trying to find out anything that I could just as much as the police were. The type of person that he was and the personality that he had, he just didn't make enemies. So I really was lost at who could have done something like that to him. I couldn't make sense of his death.
According to KC, the only things that ever got Lauren into trouble were his good looks and charm.
Lauren tend to be a little messy with it sometimes. A lot of blurred lines, not making things clear with, the different women in his life, which could lead to some, messy situations.
Lauren High was a gentleman and a charmer, and he was loved by the ladies, maybe a little too much.
Milwaukee detectives are investigating the murder of 28-year-old Lauren High. His friends say his complicated relationships with the many women in his life might be a source of conflict. So police contact his close ex-girlfriend, Suzette Bourgeois, to see what she can tell them. Suzette says she last spoke to Lauren on February 1st, 4 days before his body was found.
He said that he was on his way to the Western Union and he would call me when he got done. It's not really the safest place, especially, after dark. And I remember telling him, I said, do you want me to stay on the phone with you while you go up there and do that? And he said, no, it should only take a few minutes, I'll be in and out. And I said, well, be safe, I love you. And he said, I love you too, I'm gonna call you right back. And I never heard from him again.
Suzette explains it's unusual he didn't call back when he said he would. When investigators ask Suzette if Lauren had any enemies, she immediately says yes. He'd recently come out of a bad relationship with a woman named Portia Humphrey.
When Lauren met Portia, he was at a space in his life where he didn't want to be alone. A lot of times when people are alone, they will do anything to have somebody around, even if the person mistreats them. He was so blinded, and he didn't see it, but everybody else saw it.
According to Suzette, Lauren tried to break up with Portia several times, but she wouldn't let go.
A few months after they broke up, we started dating, and she would still pop up every now and then. She would break his windows or, try to force her way in the house. She'd just do anything she could to mess up his day.
She says Portia's tantrums culminated in a frightening incident on January 20th, 2017.
I was on FaceTime with him while he was playing a video game with one of his friends. And all of a sudden we just hear like this banging at the door, and it's Portia. She's trying to force her way in the house, saying that she needs to use the bathroom. He was like, you gotta go.
But Portia was persistent.
After 30 minutes of struggling, his friend's like, just let her use the bathroom so she can get out of here.
What happens next was so bizarre, it stunned everyone.
She comes out without her clothes on, and she laid on the couch, and, she tried to convince him, to have sexual encounter with him. And Lauren and his friend took her clothes and belongings and placed them outside and said, you need to go. As she's putting on her clothes, she's breaking the front windows and she's screaming, me and my boyfriend are gonna come back and kill you. She's yelling all types of threats and crazy things and breaking things and just being disruptive.
In light of what's happened, Suzette believes Portia decided to make good on her threat.
There wasn't a doubt in my mind that it was Portia. That was the only person that had ever caused him any type of problems and was consistent with it.
Investigators immediately contact Portia, and she agrees to come in for an interview on February 6th.
So Portia says she's known Lauren approximately 8 years. They've been doing the whole dating on again, off again thing. And then they broke up because he was cheating on her. But now she's with someone else. She's moved on.
Portia claims that the last time she saw Lauren was on January 20th, but says he texted her to meet on February 1st.
Lauren was a gentleman, and he didn't want to ghost her. What he wanted to do was sit down and have a conversation with Portia and let her know that the relationship was over.
Portia told the investigators that she did in fact plan to meet up with Lauren to have a conversation, but she had proof that she never made it. She pulls out of her purse receipts and text messages just validating her whereabouts for that day.
By that time, they had access to Lauren's phone, so that was easy to verify. And they can see multiple messages between Portia and Lauren on the 1st.
She was able to produce substantial documentation as to where she was on February the 1st. The detectives asked Portia about Lauren's .40 caliber gun. Portia confirmed with the detectives that she knew about the gun and that at some point in time, she actually held the gun.
But as investigators turn up the heat on their questions, Portia begins to change her story.
During the questioning, they kind of backtracked a little bit with Portia and asked some questions that were already asked. And she was asked about the gun again, and this time she said that she had not touched the gun.
She also changes small details in other parts of her story, a common sign that someone is lying.
Her credibility is not adding up. The detectives at that point made the decision to arrest Portia for obstruction because it was obvious that she was withholding material information and stopping the investigation from moving forward by providing false information.
The obstruction charge allows detectives to hold Portia while they look for enough evidence to increase it to murder.
They obtain a search warrant. When the officers get to Portia's house, they get a major break in the case.
Two days after Lauren High was found murdered, detectives hurried to Waukesha, Wisconsin to search the home of their prime suspect, Lauren's ex-girlfriend, Portia Humphrey.
When they went to Portia's house, Portia's sister was present. That gave the detectives an opportunity to ask her questions about what she knew about Lauren and Portia's relationship and if she knew anything at all about Lauren's death. Portia's sister told the detectives that she was concerned about Portia because she was acting depressed because she found out that Lauren had gotten shot on February the 2nd.
Yet his body was not discovered until February 5th.
How did Portia know that Lauren got shot on February 2nd? And why didn't she tell the officers that same story? She just told the detectives that she hadn't seen Lauren, didn't know anything, hadn't talked to him.
Portia's sister also tells police that when she came home from work on February 4th, she noticed something odd. A garbage bag full of clothes sitting in the bathtub that she hung up to dry.
The items of clothing included a woman's winter coat, boots, hat, scarf, mittens. They were all wet and soaked with bleach. And who cleans their clothes like that unless they're trying to hide evidence?
This definitely sent more red flags behind Portia and her whereabouts that night.
Police confiscate 4 cell phones from Portia's residence, along with her bus passes, to track her movements on the 1st.
Those passes, called M cards, they're used to ride the bus in Milwaukee County. So with that, they can look for evidence of a suspect's movement.
It will take some time to collect that information, however. Back at the crime lab, one of the pieces of evidence from Lauren's home appears to confirm Portia was at the crime scene.
Now the lab results have come back, and it's come out that the white residue found on the piece of glass was actually ecstasy, and the fingerprint on the glass belonged to Portia.
It doesn't surprise detectives, who know Lauren didn't do anything stronger than marijuana. The problem is investigators still can't prove when Portia was there. After conferring with prosecutors, detectives decide they don't have enough yet for a murder charge.
They did not have anything substantial to hold her, so they had to release her.
A week later, on February 13th, Lauren's friends and family gather for his funeral. Portia is the last person anyone expects to show up, but she does.
Portia had been calling all the way up until the funeral every day. What's going on? Did you hear anything? Do you know if they have a killer or do they have a suspect? I said, I don't know. I don't know, because honestly, I didn't know. But I remember saying, like, is it something you gotta hide? Why you keep asking like that? And she says, oh, I was just curious.
I remember some of the people that were attending stating that she sat in the back with sunglasses on. While the funeral is going on, Portia is on Facebook.
She had this smirk on her face, like, it was horrible. Like, this smirk was like devilish.
Lauren's loved ones put up with Portia when he was alive, but now they're more convinced than ever she's responsible for his death.
I just didn't see things going right, just based off of the stuff that he would tell me, you know, how she was starting to be really mean to him, very disrespectful, curse him out, you know, kind of degrade his character.
Portia was definitely abusive to Lauren. It was several times he came over my house with scratches on his neck, scratches on his face, in the back of his neck, on his arms. And I'd ask him what happened, and he'd blow me off. I would tell him, that's not love. That's not love. But he had a heart, and the heart loves who the heart loves.
Lauren and Portia were on again, off again for some time, and it just seemed like they just could not break that soul tie. But it came to a point that Lauren knew that he had to end the relationship.
Lauren called me and told me he had a serious, like, nail in a coffin conversation with Portia. Like, I'm done with you, I'm moving on with my life, and I hope you do the same, and I wish you the best. But it wasn't like that with her, like the hurt in her heart, the resentment, like the anger, the anguish would not allow her to accept that he was moving on. So it just got worse. He told her I'd rather, like, be friends, but she didn't want to be friends. It was, if I can't have you, no one can have you.
Portia Humphrey is the primary suspect in the murder of Lauren High, but police still don't have enough evidence to charge her with the crime.
They've got the cell phones, but it takes a while to track that data and analyze it. But remember, they've got Portia's Metro bus passes, so it's clear where she's been for the past few weeks.
Now, mind you, Portia doesn't stay anywhere near where Lauren lived at. She didn't have a car, so she would have to take 3 city buses there and 3 city buses back. So you're taking 3 city buses to break out somebody's windows or to pick a fight with them because they're moving on with their life.
When detectives checked the bus system's security cameras for February 1st, they hit the jackpot.
So surveillance footage from Milwaukee County Transit System saw Portia get on a bus about a half a mile from Lauren's house on February 1st around 5:14 p.m. She was wearing the same outfit that they later found in her bathtub.
This included a maroon coat, scarf, hat, boots, all of the things that Portia had in her bathroom at the time.
So at this point, it's apparent that Portia tried to bleach her clothes and clean them to get rid of any blood or DNA. That, coupled with that fingerprint that they found in Lauren's house, sounds like a smoking gun.
Finally, on March 13th, 2017, investigators get the data from Portia's phone.
That put her in Lauren's house at the time of the murder.
Portia told the detectives that she didn't see Lauren, that she was supposed to go over that particular night, but she never made it. However, the cell phone records said otherwise. Her cell phone was pinging in Lauren's house between the hours of about 7:30 to 11:30 that night. At this point of the investigation, all of the evidence is pointing back overwhelmingly to Portia. You have your fingerprint on the glass, you have your cell phone records showing that you're there, you have your MTA records showing that you were also present in the clothes that were in your bathroom. Portia is absolutely the primary suspect for Lauren's death.
She was jealous of all the people that was around Lauren that loved and cared about him.
She didn't like any of his friends, and pretty much anybody that was close to Lauren or gave him any type of attention, Portia had an issue with.
She said it too many times, like, it's over a dozen times I can remember her saying, if she couldn't have him, nobody could. She made out on her word. That's the most hurtful and disturbing part of it all. Like, she was so serious, and we just thought she was playing, but she really wasn't.
4 days after getting the phone information, on March 17th, police arrest Portia Humphrey at her workplace in Pewaukee, Wisconsin. This time, she has little to say to investigators.
Do you want to talk to me right now?
I want to talk to my lawyer.
Okay. So you're asking for a lawyer?
Please. Oh, I have one already.
Ultimately, Portia was arrested and charged with first-degree reckless homicide. This is showing that she is in some way responsible for the death of Lauren.
I believe Curtis was the one who told me she was in custody. And even with seeing she was in custody, it didn't make me feel any better. It wasn't a relief. It wasn't a sigh of joy, because I already knew.
Despite the wealth of circumstantial evidence against Portia, prosecutors still face a challenge convincing a jury.
With all the evidence gathered that led to Portia being arrested, they still don't know exactly what happened that night.
Detective Campbell let me know that, it's a possibility that she might get off because there wasn't a weapon found.
After a month-long investigation, Portia Humphrey has been charged with the murder of her ex-boyfriend, Lauren High, though there is no eyewitness and the murder weapon has not been found.
This is a case where there's no proverbial smoking gun, but there's a lot of evidence against her, so she has to decide to roll the dice on a murder trial.
Portia's lawyer approached the prosecutor in the case and requested a plea deal. Portia did not want to spend all of her life in jail, and in this plea agreement, the prosecutor agreed to charge Portia with a lower offense of second-degree reckless homicide in exchange for Portia's testimony on the stand as to what happened that night.
The prosecution suggests a sentence of 10 to 12 years. On January 1st, 2018, Portia takes the stand and swears an oath to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. But her story is completely different from the one prosecutors are expecting.
According to Portia, she did in fact go over to Lauren's house that night. They were hanging out, got drunk. She eventually supposedly asked to see his gun so she can learn how to shoot it. And while they were doing that, Portia mishandled the gun and ended up shooting Lauren.
She said she accidentally shot Lauren in the chest, was afraid of what had happened, decided to leave to attempt to cover it up.
When I first heard that story that Portia told, I thought it was bullcrap. I didn't believe it for 1 second. I don't see why he would have taken the one day that he said, I don't want to be with you and I want to be away from you, as the opportunity to show her how to use a gun.
You panicked that much that you couldn't call the police, the ambulance. Even if you were scared you was gonna go to jail, you could have still called and sent them some help. But you didn't do any of that. You give this fake story of what happened. This was supposed to be your man and you loved him.
But one accidental gunshot does not explain the 2 spent shell casings. Portia's testimony contradicts what Lauren's loved ones believe.
I, without a shadow of a doubt, believe Portia killed my friend in cold blood.
All of Lauren's friends believe that Portia killed Lauren because he wanted to end the relationship with her. This murder was Portia's payback for Lauren's abandonment of her.
I truly believe that not only did Portia want revenge for whatever reason, I just believe that she wanted to control him and control what was going on in his life, his happiness, his mood, everything, even after the fact that they were broken up, even though she already had another boyfriend.
She felt like her love outweighed anybody else's love with him. That meant grandmother, children, friends, acquaintances, co-workers. It did not matter. If she wasn't his all in all, he wasn't gonna have an all in all.
At her sentencing hearing, Portia apologizes to Lauren's family. The judge says that he believes her remorse. And citing the fact that Portia did not bring the weapon and has kids of her own, he sentences Portia Humphrey to just 9 years in prison plus 6 years of supervision after her release.
The 9 years that she got, it wasn't fair at all. It most definitely was a slap in the face. It's a continuous slap in the face, because if she makes it out of jail, she has a chance to, reconcile with her children or, try to be better with them. She gets to come home. Lauren doesn't get to come home.
My heart breaks for Lauren's girls. They were very young when he passed away, and they're just now 2 children, 2 statistics, unfortunately, that are going to be growing up without a father that was lost to a senseless gun crime.
They won't have the experience of, hey, I know my dad was a handyman. I know he could fix a car. I know he could cook a good steak. I know how smart he was. They won't never get any of that. She took that.
Lauren was lonely. He had a huge void in his heart from his mom being gone, and he looked for love in a lot of places. And Portia gave him a good feeling at some point, and I don't know if it was just he was hooked on her or...
At first, there was nothing unusual about the morning. The sky above Quebec was beginning another ordinary September day. People were moving through the routines that make up a life before anyone realizes that life is about to change forever. At the airport near Quebec City, passengers carried luggage across the terminal, exchanged brief goodbyes, checked tickets, and climbed aboard a Douglas DC-3 operated by Canadian Pacific Airlines. It was the kind of morning people later struggle to remember, because tragedy rarely announces itself. There was no warning written across the sky. No passenger stood in the aisle and shouted that something was wrong. No one looked at the woman sitting among the other travelers and understood that she was carrying a secret far more dangerous than anything inside her suitcase. Her name was Rita Morel-Gay. She was a wife. She was a mother. She was one of 19 passengers aboard Flight 108 that morning. And somewhere behind her, on the ground, was the man who had decided that she should die, not because she had attacked him, not because she had threatened him, not because he believed she was dangerous. He wanted her dead because he wanted to be free. Free to marry another woman. Free to collect money from an insurance policy. Free to begin a new life, without Rita standing in the way. But Albert Gay had made one fatal mistake. He had convinced himself that only one person needed to die. He was wrong. On September 9th, 1949, 23 people would board an airplane that was supposed to carry them toward the north shore of the St. Lawrence River. 23 people would never reach their destination. 19 passengers. For crew members, 23 lives reduced to fragments of metal, clothing, luggage, and human remains scattered across the earth at Salto-Cochon. And behind those deaths was not a foreign enemy, not a political extremist, not a military operation, and not some mysterious stranger hiding in the darkness. It was a husband. A man who had looked at the woman he married and decided that murder was easier than divorce. Albert Gay was not the kind of man people immediately imagined when they heard the word murderer. He was a jeweler and watch salesman in Quebec. He knew how to speak to customers. He knew how to make a transaction feel ordinary. He knew how to move through society without attracting the kind of attention that follows a visibly dangerous man. There was no monster's face waiting to be discovered. There was simply a man who had learned how to hide what he wanted. And what Albert Gay wanted was Marie-Ange Robitaille. She was younger. She was the woman he wanted to marry. And in Gay's mind, there was an obstacle between himself and that future. Rita, his wife. The woman who had become inconvenient. For Gay, the problem was not whether Rita deserved to live. The problem was how to make her death look like something else. That distinction is where this story becomes truly disturbing. Because murder was not enough. Albert Gay wanted a murder without a murderer. He wanted Rita to disappear inside an accident. He wanted investigators to see twisted metal and scattered wreckage and reach the simplest conclusion possible. Mechanical failure. Pilot error. Bad luck. Anything but him. So he began to construct a plan. And the plan required something more than courage. It required machinery. It required explosives. It required other people. And above all, it required timing. Gay understood that killing Rita at home would leave a trail leading directly back to him. A dead wife, an unhappy marriage, a new lover, and a husband who stood to gain financially from her death would make an uncomfortable collection of facts. But an airplane crash was different. An airplane could fall from the sky and kill everyone aboard. When that happened in 1949, people did not immediately imagine that someone had deliberately placed a bomb inside the aircraft. They imagined an accident. That was the shield Gay wanted. He wanted the deaths of 23 people to be swallowed by the machinery of aviation. He wanted the wreckage to disappear. He wanted the evidence scattered. And most importantly, He wanted Rita's death to become one tragedy among many. The plan was chilling in its simplicity. A bomb would be placed aboard the aircraft. A timer would determine when it exploded. The airplane would be in the air. The passengers would have no chance. Gay did not need to be aboard. He did not need to touch Rita. He did not need to pull a trigger. All he needed was for a device to do what he had arranged for it to do. To build that device, he turned to a man named Gennaro Roost. Roost had mechanical knowledge and the ability to construct an explosive mechanism. Gay presented him with a purpose that was far less sinister than the one he had actually conceived. The device would involve dynamite and a timing mechanism, but the truth would remain hidden, at least for a while. Then there was Marguerite Petra, Ruth's sister. She would become another link in the chain, another person who would carry the consequences of Gay's decision without fully understanding where that decision was leading. That is one of the darkest characteristics of this case. Gay did not simply kill people. He built a path toward murder and persuaded other people to walk along it, step by step, person by person, until the final object was placed inside an aircraft. And then there was Rita. Whatever Gay may have told himself, whatever excuses he may have constructed inside his own mind, the central fact remained brutally simple. She trusted the man who wanted her dead. She had no reason to believe that the person standing closest to her had already imagined her funeral. She could not see the insurance policy. She could not see the calculations. She could not see the bomb. She could not see the future Gay had already designed for himself. And perhaps that is what makes the opening of this story so painful. Rita did not know that she had already become the center of a murder plot. She was simply going about her life. On the morning of September 9th, 1949, she boarded Flight 108. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-3, a familiar workhorse of post-war aviation. It was built to carry people across distances that had once required much longer journeys. Inside its cabin, passengers sat close together, surrounded by the ordinary belongings of ordinary lives. Someone may have been thinking about business. Someone may have been thinking about family. Someone may have been looking forward to reaching Bakomo. Someone may have been wondering what awaited them at the end of the journey. They did not know that the clock had already begun counting down. There were 23 people aboard. Only one of them was the intended target. But the bomb could not distinguish between a wife and a stranger. It could not distinguish between someone who had wronged Gay and someone who had never met him. It could not distinguish between a crew member doing his job and a passenger sitting quietly beside a window. To the explosive device, they were all the same. And that is the moment when this stops being a story about one unhappy marriage. It becomes a story about how one man's private obsession consumed the lives of people who had nothing to do with him. The aircraft lifted into the sky. Below it, Quebec stretched toward the St. Lawrence. Above the ground, the passengers were moving farther away from the possibility of rescue with every passing second. And somewhere inside the aircraft was the object Gay had arranged to be there. The plan depended on one thing above everything else: timing. Gay wanted the explosion to happen after the aircraft had reached an area where the wreckage would be difficult to recover. The St. Lawrence offered him what he believed was the perfect solution. If the aircraft broke apart over the water, evidence could disappear beneath the surface. The river could swallow metal. It could scatter debris. It could erase the physical story of what had happened. And if the aircraft vanished into the water, the truth might vanish with it. Gay believed he had considered everything. But there was one variable he could not control. The flight was delayed. Only a matter of minutes. A small inconvenience. The kind of delay that passengers complain about and forget. The kind of delay that normally means nothing. But on this morning, a few minutes would become the difference between a mystery and a murder investigation. The aircraft did not reach the place Gay had expected it to reach when the timer reached its appointed moment. Instead, Flight 108 was still near land. Then the explosion came. There was no time for the passengers to understand what was happening. The aircraft was suddenly torn apart. The ordinary world inside the cabin ceased to exist. Metal fractured. The fuselage broke. The sky filled with debris. The aircraft plunged toward the ground. And somewhere beneath that falling wreckage was the last physical evidence of 19 passengers and 4 crew members who had begun the morning expecting nothing more than a journey. 23 people died. The number is easy to say. 23. But numbers can become strangely clean when separated from the people they represent. So stop for a moment and imagine what 23 means. 23 voices that would never speak again. 23 sets of hands that would never touch another person. 23 families who would wait for people who were never coming home. 23 stories that ended without warning. And one of those stories belonged to Rita Gay, the woman Albert Gay wanted removed from his life, the woman whose death was supposed to give him freedom, the woman whose life had been assigned a monetary value through an insurance policy, 10,000 Canadian dollars. That was part of Gay's calculation. A wife, a lover, an insurance policy, a bomb, a plane, and a future he believed he could purchase with blood. But there was something Gay had not anticipated. The airplane had not disappeared into the river. It had crashed on land, and land leaves evidence. The wreckage could be reached. The debris could be examined. The dead could be identified. The investigators could walk through the aftermath. And when investigators began looking at what had happened to Flight 108, they found something that changed everything. Dynamite. The possibility of mechanical failure began to collapse. This was not simply a machine that had failed. Someone had brought destruction aboard. Someone had placed an explosive inside a passenger aircraft. Someone had decided that 23 people should die. The investigation had crossed a line. It was no longer an aviation accident. It was murder. And once the investigators understood that, the question became unavoidable. Who would want to destroy Flight 108? At first, that question seemed almost impossible to answer. There were 19 passengers. For crew members, people from different backgrounds, different destinations, different lives. Why would anyone want all of them dead? Then investigators looked at the passenger list, and they found Rita Gay, a married woman, a woman whose husband was alive, a woman whose husband had recently arranged life insurance in her name, a woman whose husband was in love with someone else. Suddenly, the crash began to look different. The wreckage was no longer only a pile of metal. It was a message. Someone had tried to turn a murder into an accident, and the more investigators looked, the more the name Albert Gay began to rise from beneath the surface. But Gay was not standing beside the wreckage. He had not been aboard the aircraft. He had not been seen placing a bomb inside the cabin. He could have remained an ordinary husband grieving the loss of his wife. That was the role he needed to play. A widower, a grieving man, a victim of the same tragedy that had taken everyone else. But investigators were already looking at him from a different angle. Because the dead can no longer speak. The wreckage cannot explain why a bomb was there. The passengers cannot tell investigators what they saw. But the people left behind can be questioned. And Gay had left behind something far more revealing than grief. He had left a trail made of money, romance, deception, dynamite, a timed device, and other people who knew more than they should. The first great mistake had already been made. Gay had assumed the explosion would erase the evidence. Instead, it created evidence. He had assumed the water would swallow the truth. Instead, the aircraft fell where investigators could reach it. He had assumed that killing Rita would free him. Instead, her death became the first thread in a chain that would eventually lead directly back to him. And yet, at this moment, Albert Gay was still alive. He was still free. He could still walk through the streets. He could still speak to people. He could still look into the eyes of those investigating the deaths and pretend that he was one of the grieving. He had created the perfect accident, or at least, he believed he had. What he did not understand was that a crime does not end when the victim dies. Sometimes, that is when the real story begins. The wreckage at Salto Cochon was only the beginning. The investigators had 23 dead. They had an aircraft destroyed by an explosion. They had dynamite. They had a woman who had died under suspicious circumstances. And somewhere in Quebec was a husband who had every reason to want his wife gone. The question was no longer whether someone had murdered the passengers of Flight 108. The question was how far Albergay had gone to make it happen. And as investigators began pulling apart the pieces of the crash, they would uncover a story even more disturbing than the explosion itself. Because the bomb had not appeared on that airplane by accident. Someone had planned it. Someone had built it. Someone had carried it to the airport. Someone had placed it aboard the aircraft. And someone had been waiting on the ground, believing that when the explosion came, he would finally be free. His name was Albergay. And on September 9th, 1949, 23 people paid the ultimate price for the future he wanted. Albergay did not wake up on the morning of September 9th, 1949, believing that history would remember his name. He was not a soldier preparing for battle. He was not a fugitive running from the law. He was not a stranger to the people around him. He was a husband, a businessman, a man who sold watches and jewelry and knew the ordinary rhythms of respectable life. He knew how to shake hands. He knew how to smile at customers. He knew how to make conversation. He knew how to appear ordinary. And perhaps that was the most dangerous thing about him, because Albergay did not look like the kind of man who would deliberately send a passenger airplane full of innocent people into the ground. He looked like someone who belonged in the world around him. That world was changing rapidly. Canada was only a few years removed from the Second World War. The country was moving into a new era. Aircraft were becoming an increasingly familiar part of civilian life. The great distances between cities were shrinking. People could board an airplane in one place and expect to be hundreds of miles away before the day was over. Flying still carried a certain sense of danger, but for most passengers, that danger remained abstract. They trusted the aircraft. They trusted the crew. They trusted the people who maintained the machines. And they trusted something else without ever thinking about it. They trusted that nobody had a reason to deliberately destroy them. That assumption was about to be shattered. But before the airplane fell, before the investigators arrived at the wreckage, before the names of 23 dead passengers appeared in newspapers, there was another story unfolding quietly inside the life of Albergay. It was a story about dissatisfaction, about resentment, about desire, and about the moment when a man stops seeing another human being as a person and begins seeing her as an obstacle. Guy's marriage to Rita Morel had deteriorated. The details of a marriage are rarely visible from the outside. Neighbors may hear an argument through a wall, but they do not know what happened before it. Friends may notice that a husband and wife no longer stand close to each other. Family members may recognize a coldness in the way two people speak. But marriage can become a private world. Behind a closed door, resentment can accumulate for years. And by 1949, Guy had already found another woman. Her name was Marie-Ange Robitaille. She represented something new, something exciting, something that Guy wanted. In his mind, the future was waiting. But there was a problem. Rita was still there. Divorce existed as a possibility. But Guy did not want to wait for the complications, the embarrassment, the financial consequences, or the social consequences. He wanted the old life to disappear immediately. And gradually, a thought that should have been unthinkable became something he was willing to consider. What if Rita simply died? That question is important because murder rarely begins with a physical act. It often begins somewhere much earlier. It begins as a thought, a fantasy, a private sentence that the person does not say aloud. What if she were gone? At first, perhaps even the person thinking it is disturbed by the thought. Then the thought returns. And each time it returns, it becomes easier to imagine. Eventually, the question changes. Not whether she should die, But how? Gway's mind moved toward a solution that was both cruel and calculated. If Rita died in an ordinary accident, he could mourn her. He could stand beside her grave. He could tell people how devastated he was. He could become the grieving husband instead of the suspected killer. And if the accident involved an airplane, there would be another advantage. Rita would not die alone. The presence of other victims would make her death seem less personal. That was the logic. It was grotesque, but to Gay it was practical. He began thinking about the possibility of putting an explosive device aboard an aircraft. The plan depended on timing. A timer could be set so that the explosion occurred after the airplane had reached a particular point in its journey. If everything went according to plan, the aircraft would be over the St. Lawrence River. The wreckage would fall into the water. The evidence would disappear, and Rita's death would be buried inside what appeared to be an aviation tragedy. It was not enough for Gay to kill. He wanted to control the story of the killing. He wanted the world to believe something different. That distinction would eventually become one of the most important elements of the case, because Gay was not simply planning a murder. He was planning the explanation that would come afterward. He needed an explosive device. He needed someone capable of making it, and he needed someone willing to carry it. This was where General Roost entered the story. Roost was not simply a random stranger Gay found on the street. He was someone within Gway's circle. He had mechanical knowledge and understood how to construct devices. Gay approached him with a story that concealed the real purpose. The device would involve dynamite. There would be a timer. But Roost was not initially presented with the truth as Gay understood it. He was not told that the device was intended to destroy a passenger aircraft. He was not told that a woman would be inside. He was not told that 22 other people would die with her. Or at least, that was the defense he would later offer. And that question would become central to his own trial. How much did Roost know? How much should he have known? And at what point does ignorance stop being an excuse? Those questions would come later. For the moment, Gay needed the device. Roost produced it. Dynamite. A timing mechanism. A package that could be transported without immediately attracting attention. The ingredients of the murder were now taking physical form. But Gay still had another problem. Someone had to take the package to the airport. That person became Marguerite Petra. She was Ruth's sister. And once again, Gay used deception. He told her the package was harmless. There was no reason, from her perspective, to imagine that she was carrying an object that could destroy an aircraft. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. The bomb did not travel to the aircraft in the hands of some obvious criminal. It moved through ordinary human relationships. One person built it, another person carried it, and behind them stood the man who wanted his wife dead. The chain was almost complete, but Gay still needed Rita to board the flight. And that is where the cruelty of the plan becomes difficult to comprehend. Rita was not being lured into an unknown situation. She was simply living her life. She did not know that her husband had been thinking about her death. She did not know that an insurance policy had been arranged. She did not know that a device containing dynamite was being prepared. She did not know that her name had become the center of a murder conspiracy. She simply boarded a plane. There is something profoundly unsettling about imagining that final ordinary moment. A person takes a seat. She places her belongings where they belong. She looks around the cabin. Perhaps she watches another passenger settle into a seat. Perhaps she looks through the window. Perhaps she thinks about where she is going. Nothing appears wrong. The airplane is simply an airplane. The other passengers are simply passengers. The crew are doing their jobs. And the man responsible for her death is not there. That absence would become one of Gway's greatest advantages. He could remain on the ground. He could watch the journey begin from a distance. He could tell himself that the worst part was already over. The device had been delivered. The flight had been boarded. The plan was moving forward. But there was another element Gay believed he could control. The time. He expected the explosion to occur after the airplane had reached the right location. He wanted the river beneath it. He wanted the water to become his accomplice. The St. Lawrence was vast. It could scatter wreckage across the current. It could conceal evidence. It could make recovery difficult. If the airplane disappeared into the river, the cause of the crash might never be understood. And if investigators never discovered the bomb, then there would be no obvious connection to Gay. He could collect the insurance money. He could grieve Rita. And eventually, he could marry Marie-Ange. That was the future he imagined. A future built from the death of his wife. But human beings are terrible at predicting the consequences of their own crimes. They imagine the moment of success. They rarely imagine every variable that can go wrong. Guy's plan depended on a clock. And a clock is an unforgiving thing. A few minutes can change the location of an aircraft by miles. A few minutes can turn water into land. A few minutes can determine whether evidence disappears forever or lands where investigators can find it. And on that morning, the flight was delayed. The delay was not dramatic. There was no catastrophe at the airport. No one watching the schedule would have understood its significance. Passengers waited. The aircraft departed later than Gay had expected, and somewhere inside the plane, the timer continued to count down. The people aboard had no way of knowing that the difference between their lives and their deaths had been reduced to a matter of minutes. The aircraft began its journey, and as it climbed away from the ground, the distance between the passengers and safety increased. Below them, Quebec continued its ordinary morning. People walked along streets. Cars moved through the countryside. Homes stood quietly beneath the September sky. Nobody looking upward could have understood what was happening inside that aircraft. The plane was not simply carrying passengers. It was carrying a secret, and that secret was counting down. Then the moment arrived. The explosive device detonated. The airplane was torn apart. There was no time for the passengers to understand, no opportunity to escape, no warning long enough to process. The aircraft fell, and the lives of 23 people ended. But the explosion did something Gay had never intended. It preserved the truth. Because the aircraft did not disappear beneath the St. Lawrence. It came down at Salto Cochon, on land. That meant investigators could reach the wreckage. They could examine the debris. They could search for the cause. And they could begin reconstructing what had happened. Gay had imagined the river as a graveyard for evidence. Instead, the ground became a witness. The investigators arrived to a scene of devastation. The aircraft that had carried living people only moments earlier had been reduced to wreckage. The human cost was everywhere. Fragments of the aircraft, personal belongings, pieces of luggage, objects that had belonged to people who would never return for them. And among the wreckage were clues. At first, the investigators did not know exactly what they were looking for, but they knew something was wrong. The damage was consistent with an explosion. And then came the discovery that would transform the case: dynamite. Suddenly, the tragedy had a different shape. An airplane crash could be caused by mechanical failure. It could be caused by weather. It could be caused by human error. But dynamite inside a passenger aircraft was something else. It meant intent. Someone had wanted this airplane destroyed. Someone had wanted all the people aboard it dead. The investigators now had a murder scene, but they did not yet have a murderer. That distinction mattered. The dead could not tell them who had planted the bomb. The wreckage could tell them that an explosion had occurred, but it could not tell them why. So the investigators began looking at the victims. Who were they? Where were they going? What connections existed between them? And eventually one name stood out: Rita Guay. Then another name became important: her husband, Albert Gay. The man who had recently arranged life insurance connected to Rita's life. The man who was involved with another woman. The man who had a reason to want Rita gone. And suddenly, the investigation had its first possible motive: money, love, freedom, jealousy. All four could exist inside the same murder. But suspicion was not proof. Gay could still say that he had lost his wife. He could still say that he was devastated. He could still insist that he knew nothing about the bomb. And if he was convincing enough, perhaps the investigation would move in another direction. Perhaps the case would become an unsolved aviation mystery. Perhaps the deaths of 23 people would remain unexplained. But Gay had underestimated one thing. Every person he had brought into his plan had become a potential witness. Every conversation could be remembered. Every package had a history. Every transaction left a trace. Every lie required another lie to support it. And as investigators began following those connections, the carefully constructed story Albert Gay had imagined for himself began to crack. The husband, the lover, the insurance policy, the explosive, the aircraft, the delay, the wreckage, the witnesses. The story was beginning to assemble itself, and somewhere inside that story was the answer to the most important question of all. Why would a man risk the lives of 23 people simply to remove one woman from his life? The answer would reveal something darker than greed, because Gay did not merely want Rita dead. He wanted her death to purchase a new life for himself. And the more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that the lives of 23 strangers had been treated as nothing more than collateral damage in one man's private fantasy of freedom. But the investigation was only beginning. The first arrests were still ahead. The interrogations had not yet exposed the full conspiracy. The courtroom had not yet heard the testimony. And Albert Gay had not yet stood before a judge and listened to the evidence being assembled against him. For the moment, he remained a free man, a husband who had supposedly lost his wife, a grieving man surrounded by questions, a man who had believed that the explosion would erase his secrets. Instead, it had created a trail leading directly back to him, and every step along that trail would bring investigators closer to the truth that Flight 108 had not fallen by accident, the truth that Rita Gay had not been the victim of fate, the truth that 23 people had been sacrificed for the desires of one man, and the truth that Albert Gay had not planned a tragedy. He had planned a murder. He simply never imagined how many graves it would require. There's a particular cruelty in a crime that hides inside an ordinary day. Nothing about the morning of September 9th, 1949, announced that 23 people were about to die. There was no battlefield, no warning siren, no armed man waiting at the door of the aircraft. There was only a passenger list, a departure schedule, a collection of suitcases, and a group of people who believed they were traveling toward ordinary destinations. Somewhere among those passengers was Rita Gay, and somewhere behind the scenes, a plan was already in motion. The most terrifying thing about Albert Gay's plan was not that it was complicated. It was that he had reduced murder to a sequence of ordinary actions. A package had to be prepared. A device had to be constructed. A woman had to carry it. A ticket had to be purchased. A passenger had to board. A timer had to be set. Then everyone had to wait. That was all. There was no need for Gay to stand over Rita with a weapon. There was no need for a confrontation. No need for blood on his hands at the moment of death. He had designed something that could kill for him, and that allowed him to remain physically distant from the violence. It is one of the oldest psychological tricks of murder, creating distance between intention and consequence. A person presses a button, someone else dies. A person signs a document, someone else loses their home. A person gives an order, someone else pulls the trigger. Gay had taken that separation to an extraordinary level. He wanted Rita dead without having to watch her die. And because the bomb would destroy an aircraft, he had also created a convenient way to bury her death beneath the deaths of strangers. That was the genius of the plan. And that was also its greatest weakness, because the more people involved, the more opportunities there are for the truth to escape. Gay needed Roost. He needed Petra. He needed the airline. He needed the flight. He needed the passengers. He needed the timing to work. He needed the aircraft to reach the correct location. He needed the explosion to destroy the evidence. He needed Rita's death to look like an accident. Too many pieces. Too many human beings. Too many things that could go wrong. But on the morning of the flight, none of that mattered yet. The aircraft was preparing to leave. The passengers were moving through the airport. And Rita was one of them. Imagine her for a moment without knowing what we know now. Do not picture her as a name printed in an old newspaper. Do not picture her as a victim in a case file. Picture her as a living woman. A woman with memories. A woman with habits. A woman who knew the small details of her own life. The way she arranged her belongings. The people she expected to see. The places she intended to go. The future she believed she still had. She did not know that someone had already decided that her future should end that morning. And perhaps the most painful part is that the person who made that decision was the person who should have been safest to trust. Her husband, Albert Gay, had once been part of the future Rita imagined. Now, he had become the architect of its destruction. That transformation is difficult to understand if we think of murder as a sudden act of madness. Gway's crime was not sudden. It required planning. It required patience. It required him to think about the death of his wife, repeatedly, without stopping himself. Every step gave him an opportunity to change his mind. He could have walked away. He could have accepted the end of his marriage. He could have pursued a legal separation. He could have abandoned his affair. He could have allowed Rita to live. At every stage, another choice was possible, but he kept moving forward. And once the bomb was aboard the aircraft, the final choice had already been made. The people inside the cabin did not know it. They were surrounded by an invisible threat. There was no smell of danger, no warning light, no sound that told them death was sitting among them. The device was simply there, waiting. The aircraft began its journey, and with every passing minute, the distance between the passengers and the ground increased. For a murderer, the distance can create a strange illusion of control. Gay did not need to see the airplane. He only needed to trust the clock. The clock was supposed to do the rest. That was where his confidence became dangerous. He had imagined the St. Lawrence River below. He had imagined the aircraft exploding over the water. He had imagined the wreckage sinking. He had imagined investigators searching for answers and finding nothing. He had imagined Rita's death becoming an accident. Perhaps he had even imagined himself standing at a funeral, wearing the face of a grieving husband. Perhaps he had imagined the money, $10,000. Perhaps he had imagined Marie-Ange, a new marriage, a new home, a new beginning. The old life would be gone. The wife would be gone. The problem would be gone. But the future Gay imagined depended on a simple assumption, that the world would behave exactly as he expected. It did not. The flight was delayed. A few minutes. Only a few. To an ordinary person, those minutes meant nothing. To Gway's plan, they meant everything. The timer did not care about delays. It did not care about schedules. It did not care about the distance the aircraft had traveled. Once it had been activated, time continued to move forward. The passengers could not bargain with it. The crew could not stop it. And Gay could not adjust it once the aircraft was in the air. The clock was already ticking. The airplane moved through the sky, and the people inside remained unaware. This is where the story takes on an almost unbearable sense of inevitability. The passengers were still alive. They could still talk. They could still look out of the windows. They could still think about the people waiting for them at their destinations. But somewhere inside that aircraft, a sequence had already begun. The final seconds were approaching. The people on board had no way to know. And below them, the landscape continued to pass. The St. Lawrence River stretched through the region. Gay had expected the airplane to reach the water, but the delay changed the geography of the murder. The aircraft was not where he expected it to be. The bomb did not care. The timer reached its appointed moment. Then the explosion came. For the people aboard Flight 108, there was no meaningful transition between life and death. One moment there was an aircraft. The next, there was destruction. The explosion ripped through the plane. The structure that had protected the passengers became fragments. The aircraft fell toward the earth. And the ground at Salto Cochon became the final destination of 23 people. The explosion was over in an instant. But for the families of the victims, the real nightmare had only begun. There would be questions. Where were they? What happened? Why did the aircraft crash? Was anyone alive? Could someone have survived? Then came the terrible answer. No. There were no survivors. 23 people were dead. The news would spread. Families would hear. Names would become headlines. And behind every name was a person whose absence would leave a space that could never be filled. For investigators, however, grief had to coexist with another responsibility. They needed to know why. At first, the wreckage could have suggested a terrible accident. Airplanes could fail. Engines could malfunction. Mechanical problems could become catastrophic. But the evidence began pointing in another direction. The damage was consistent with an explosion. And then investigators found traces of dynamite. That discovery changed the meaning of every piece of wreckage. The airplane had not simply fallen. It had been destroyed. The difference was enormous. A crash is a tragedy. A deliberate explosion is a crime. Now the investigators were not simply looking for the cause of an accident. They were looking for a murderer. The first questions were obvious. Who could have placed the explosive? How had it reached the aircraft? Who had access? Who knew the flight schedule? Who knew that Rita Gay would be aboard? And perhaps most importantly, who had something to gain? The investigation began moving backward from the wreckage. Every piece of evidence became a thread. The package. The airport. The passenger. The husband. The insurance policy. The lover. The mechanical expert. The woman who had delivered the package. The threads began to connect. And when investigators looked closely at Rita's husband, they discovered something that transformed suspicion into motive. Albert Gay had purchased life insurance connected to Rita. $10,000. The amount was significant, but money alone did not explain everything. There was another woman, Marie-Ange Robitaille. Gay wanted to be with her, and Rita stood between the man and the future he desired. Now the investigators had 3 pieces of a disturbing puzzle. A wife who had died, a husband who could financially benefit from her death, and a husband who was romantically involved with another woman. The coincidence was too striking to ignore, but there was still a problem. Suspicion was not evidence. Gay could claim that the insurance policy was innocent. He could claim that his marriage was complicated but not murderous. He could claim that the explosion had nothing to do with him. And perhaps, for a moment, he believed he could still escape. After all, he had not been on the airplane. He had not carried the bomb into the cabin. He had not personally set the device. He could try to place himself outside the chain of events. But the investigators were not only interested in what Gay had done, they were interested in what other people had done for him. The package had passed through human hands. Someone had delivered it. Someone had prepared it. Someone had spoken to someone else. And every person involved was a potential weakness in Gay's plan. This is the point where a carefully constructed crime often begins to collapse. The murderer controls his own actions. He does not control the memories of everyone around him. He cannot control what another person says under questioning. He cannot control what investigators discover. He cannot control newspaper reports. He cannot control whether an accomplice becomes frightened. And he cannot control the fact that people make mistakes. Gay had made one already. The airplane had not exploded over the water. It had fallen on land. The wreckage was accessible. The evidence had survived. His first attempt to erase the crime had failed. Now, he needed another way to protect himself. And this is where his behavior would become even more revealing. As investigators moved closer, Gui's concern would no longer be only about Rita. It would be about himself. He would have to think about the people who knew what he had done. He would have to think about what they might say. He would have to think about whether they could be trusted. And eventually, he would have to decide whether saving himself meant sacrificing someone else. The answer would reveal the kind of man he truly was. But before that moment came, there was another devastating reality for the investigators to confront. The people aboard Flight 108 were not simply victims of one man's marriage. They were strangers caught inside someone else's private war. They had not agreed to participate. They had not chosen sides. They had not even known Albert Gay. Their only connection to him was that, for one brief journey, they occupied the same aircraft as the woman he wanted dead. That was enough to make them targets. And this is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of the case. When someone becomes consumed by obsession, the world around them can begin to lose its humanity. People become obstacles, numbers, costs, collateral damage. Gui's calculation did not require him to hate 22 strangers. He did not need to know their names. He only needed to decide that their lives were less important than his desired future. That is how an ordinary passenger airplane became a weapon. Not because the passengers had done anything, but because one man decided that his personal happiness was worth their deaths. The investigation would eventually expose that decision. But in the immediate aftermath, nobody knew how deep the conspiracy went. There was only the wreckage, the dead, the dynamite, and the first terrible suspicion that the crash had been intentional. Somewhere in Quebec, Albert Gay was waiting. He knew what he had arranged. He knew Rita was dead. He knew the other passengers were dead. And he knew that if the plan had worked exactly as intended, he should now be closer than ever to the life he wanted. But there was a problem. The aircraft had fallen on land. The investigators were looking, and his name was beginning to surface. The man who wanted to disappear behind an accident was suddenly standing at the center of a murder investigation. The clock that had once been his weapon had become his enemy. Every minute now gave investigators another opportunity to uncover something. Every conversation created another possible witness. Every lie created another contradiction. And every person Gay had trusted could become the person who destroyed him. The explosion had ended the lives of 23 people, but it had not ended the story. It had opened it. The next chapter would take investigators away from the wreckage and into the private world of Albert Gay, where they would begin to discover the secrets he believed were hidden safely behind the walls of his marriage. They would discover the woman he loved, the wife he wanted gone, the money he stood to receive, the people he had recruited, and the strange trail left by a package that should never have been aboard Flight 108. The investigators did not yet know how every piece fit together, but they had the beginning. 23 dead, dynamite in the wreckage, a suspicious husband, an insurance policy, and a lover waiting somewhere in the shadows of the story. Albert Gay had wanted the explosion to erase everything. Instead, it had illuminated the path. And with every step the investigators took, that path was leading them closer to his door. The man who thought he was planning the perfect murder had forgotten one simple truth. A crime can be hidden only as long as nobody looks closely enough. And now, someone was looking. Before Flight 108 became a crime scene, before the names of 23 dead passengers appeared in newspapers, before investigators began asking why an aircraft had been torn apart in the sky, Quebec was simply going about its life. It was September of 1949. The Second World War had ended only 4 years earlier, but its shadow was still present in the country. Canada was entering a different age. Cities were expanding, businesses were reopening and changing. Families were trying to return to routines that had been interrupted by years of war. Technology was moving forward, and commercial aviation was becoming an increasingly important part of everyday travel. For people who lived through that period, an airplane was still something remarkable. It was no longer an exotic machine reserved entirely for military pilots and wealthy adventurers. But neither was it as ordinary as it would become decades later. A commercial flight still carried a sense of occasion. Travelers prepared for the journey. They checked schedules carefully. They packed luggage. They said goodbye to family members. And when the aircraft finally lifted from the runway, there was still something extraordinary about watching the ground disappear beneath you. The Douglas DC-3 was one of the aircraft that helped make this new world possible. It was sturdy, familiar, and widely trusted. It had become a symbol of modern air travel, a machine capable of carrying passengers across long distances with a speed that had once seemed unimaginable. But trust in an airplane was also trust in the people operating it, trust in the pilot, trust in the crew, trust in the airline, and trust in the invisible system of schedules, maintenance, navigation, and procedures that allowed a person to step aboard in one city and expect to arrive safely in another. Nobody boarding Flight 108 that morning imagined that the greatest danger was already inside the aircraft. That danger did not look like a weapon. It looked like a package. And the man responsible for it had never needed to board the plane himself. Quebec itself provided a striking contrast to what was about to happen. The province had its own rhythms and traditions, shaped by the St. Lawrence River, old communities, churches, family businesses, and a culture in which people often lived close enough to one another that reputations mattered. In a place like this, people knew things about each other. They knew who was married. They knew who was having difficulties. They knew which businesses were successful and which were struggling. They knew when a couple seemed happy and when something had changed. But people could also hide things. A smile could conceal resentment. A polite conversation could conceal betrayal. A husband could walk through a familiar street while carrying a secret that nobody around him could see. Albert Gay lived inside that world. He was not an outsider. He was not someone who had arrived from nowhere. He was part of the community. He worked as a watch and jewelry salesman, a profession that required trust. Customers needed to believe that the person standing behind the counter was reliable. A watch was a personal object. Jewelry could carry sentimental value. Business depended on reputation. Gay knew how to present himself. That mattered. Because people rarely imagine violence coming from the person who sells them something across a counter. They imagine danger as something visible, a stranger, a threat, a raised voice, a weapon. But Gway's danger was hidden behind normality. He could speak softly. He could smile. He could discuss watches. He could talk about business. He could go home. And behind that ordinary surface, his private life was becoming increasingly complicated. His marriage to Rita Morel had deteriorated. A marriage does not necessarily collapse in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it happens slowly, almost invisibly. Affection becomes routine. Routine becomes distance. Arguments become silence. Silence becomes resentment. From the outside, people may see only the final stage. They see a couple who no longer seem close. They do not see the hundreds of small moments that came before. They do not know which words were spoken behind closed doors. They do not know which promises were broken. And they cannot know when dissatisfaction becomes hatred. What is known is that Albert Gay had become involved with another woman. Marie-Ange Robitaille represented a different future in his imagination. She was not simply another person in his life. She became the destination, the person around whom Gay began constructing a new version of himself. And once that happened, Rita's presence became increasingly inconvenient. This is important to understand because Gway's eventual crime was not committed in a vacuum. It grew out of a private obsession. He wanted to leave his existing life and replace it with another. But instead of accepting the consequences of that decision, he began looking for a way to eliminate the obstacle. The distinction between wanting something and believing one is entitled to it can be enormous. Gay wanted freedom. He wanted love. He wanted money. And he wanted those things without paying the ordinary price that life demanded. He did not want to wait. He did not want to negotiate. He did not want to endure the consequences of divorce. He wanted Rita gone. That desire would eventually become a murder plan. But before the bomb, before the timer, before the airplane, there was another important element: insurance. Money has a way of turning suspicion into evidence. A troubled marriage can have many explanations. An affair can have many explanations. Even a man's desire to leave his wife does not automatically make him a murderer. But when a wife dies and the husband stands to collect money, investigators begin asking different questions. Gay had arranged life insurance connected to Rita. The policy was worth 10,000 Canadian dollars. In 1949, that was not an insignificant amount. It represented security. It represented opportunity. And to a man imagining a new life, it could represent the financial foundation for that future. But the money was not enough by itself. Gay also had a problem that money could not solve. If Rita died under suspicious circumstances, investigators might look at him. So he needed a death that appeared random. That was the crucial idea. The more distant the cause of death, the easier it would be to hide the person responsible. An airplane crash offered exactly that possibility. An aircraft could fall. People could blame mechanical failure. They could blame weather. They could blame the pilot. They could blame almost anything. And if the wreckage disappeared into the St. Lawrence River, perhaps nobody would ever know that an explosive had caused the crash. The river became part of Gay's fantasy. He imagined it swallowing evidence. He imagined investigators searching without answers. He imagined himself standing safely on the other side of the tragedy. The plan required precision. That meant he needed help. This was where General Roost became important. Roost possessed mechanical knowledge and was capable of constructing the device Gay wanted. The details of their relationship would later become part of the legal battle over how much Roost knew. Was he merely helping construct something without understanding its true purpose? Or did he understand that the device would be used to destroy an airplane? That question would eventually determine whether Roost was merely an accomplice or something far more serious in the eyes of the law. For now, however, Gay needed the device. And Roost made it. The explosive mechanism incorporated dynamite and a timer. It was not a weapon that needed a person standing beside it. Once placed and activated, it could wait. That was exactly what Gay wanted. The machine would become his substitute. He could distance himself from the moment of death. He could remain on the ground while the device carried out his intention. But there was another problem. The package had to reach the airport. Gay turned to Marguerite Petra. Petra was Ruth's sister. According to the account that emerged later, Gay presented the package as something harmless. She did not understand that she was being drawn into a murder conspiracy. That detail would become central to the tragedy surrounding the case. Because Gay's plan depended upon ordinary people doing ordinary things without realizing what they were participating in. Roost worked with the device. Petra transported the package. Rita boarded the aircraft. And Gay waited. One person did not know the truth. Another claimed not to know the truth. The intended victim knew nothing. And the man at the center of everything believed he had found a way to control the outcome. The chain was now almost complete. The final ingredient was the flight itself. Canadian Pacific Airlines connected communities across the country. And Flight 108 was part of that network. The aircraft would travel from Montreal, stop in Quebec, and continue toward Baie-Comeau. For the passengers, it was simply transportation. They were not participants in a story. They were travelers. The distinction is important because true crime stories can sometimes reduce victims to names and numbers. But before September 9th, 1949, these people were living ordinary lives. They had responsibilities, families, plans, appointments, people waiting for them, people who expected to hear their voices again. They did not know that their lives had become attached to the private conflict between Albert Gay and his wife. They did not know Rita. They did not know Gay. They had no connection to his marriage. Yet once the bomb was placed aboard the aircraft, they became part of his plan. That is the point where the crime becomes larger than the motive. Gwei's original grievance was personal. His consequences were not. One man's unhappiness was about to become 23 funerals, and that contrast would become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. The province itself would eventually remember the event as something more than an aviation disaster. It would become a crime that people talked about for decades. But on that morning, nobody knew what was coming. The airport was still an airport. The aircraft was still an aircraft. The passengers were still alive, and the future still appeared ordinary. That is often how history begins. Not with an explosion, with routine. A person wakes up, gets dressed, leaves home, carries a bag, checks a ticket, says goodbye, boards a vehicle, and assumes that the next few hours will unfold exactly as they always do. There is something almost unbearable about knowing what those people did not know. We know the destination of their story. They did not. We know the aircraft would never complete its journey. They did not. We know there was a bomb. They did not. We know the name of the man who planned it. They did not. That difference between knowledge and ignorance is what gives the morning its tension. Every ordinary action becomes significant only because we know what follows. A suitcase being placed aboard the aircraft is no longer just a suitcase. A passenger taking a seat is no longer just a passenger taking a seat. A flight delay is no longer an inconvenience. It is a turning point. And the clock is already waiting. The bomb Gwei arranged did not understand human emotion. It did not understand marriage. It did not understand jealousy. It did not understand money. It did not understand love. It understood only time. And time was moving. The aircraft was preparing to leave. Gwei's plan was entering its final stage. He had created the motive. He had arranged the insurance. He had found the people necessary to construct and transport the device. He had selected a method that he believed would conceal his involvement. All that remained was for the machine to do what he expected. But the world does not obey the plans of a murderer. There are always variables. A delay. A misplaced object. A witness who remembers something. A person who becomes frightened. A piece of evidence that survives. Gwei believed he was controlling a sequence of events. In reality, he was creating a chain he could no longer fully control. And once Flight 108 left the ground, the final link was no longer in his hands. It was in the hands of the clock. The passengers were moving toward the sky. The bomb was moving toward its appointed moment. And Quebec continued below them, unaware that an invisible countdown had begun. In the minutes ahead, the ordinary world would be torn apart. But before the explosion, before the screams that no one outside the aircraft would ever hear, there was one final moment when everything still looked normal. 23 people were alive. The aircraft was intact. The countryside lay peacefully beneath them. The St. Lawrence stretched across the landscape, and Albert Gwei believed that, soon, his wife would be dead and his own life would finally begin. He could not have known that the same plan designed to erase his crime would instead expose it. He could not have known that the land beneath the aircraft would become a witness. He could not have known that the people he had recruited would eventually speak. And he certainly could not have known that the investigation would uncover the private life he had tried so desperately to conceal. For now, though none of that had happened, the clock continued ticking, the aircraft continued flying, and 23 unsuspecting people continued toward a destination they would never reach. The quiet morning of September 9th, 1949, was about to become one of the darkest days in Canadian aviation history. The tragedy of Flight 108 becomes easier to understand when we stop looking at the airplane as a piece of machinery and begin looking at it as a small community of human beings. For a short period of time, 23 strangers were brought together inside a narrow metal cabin. They did not choose one another. They did not know one another. They had different reasons for traveling, different destinations, different families, different worries, and different hopes for what would happen after they landed. Yet for the duration of the flight, their lives were connected. A businessman could sit only a few feet away from someone traveling to visit relatives. A crew member could walk past a passenger without knowing that the person in that seat had children waiting at home. Someone could glance toward another passenger and never imagine that both of them would soon disappear from the world at almost exactly the same moment. This is what makes the story of Flight 108 so difficult to reduce to a single crime. Albert Gay had one target, but his method created 22 additional victims. He had intended to solve one private problem. Instead, he created a public catastrophe. And the difference between those two things tells us something important about the kind of thinking that made the crime possible. Gay's world had narrowed. His marriage was no longer a relationship between two people with complicated emotions, shared memories, and a history together. Rita had become an obstacle. His affair was no longer simply an affair. It had become a future. Money was no longer simply money. It had become the means of purchasing that future. And an airplane was no longer a machine carrying strangers. It had become a weapon. Once those transformations took place inside his mind, the lives of everyone aboard Flight 108 became secondary. The people inside the aircraft did not need to matter to him. They only needed to be there. That is one of the darkest characteristics of the case. The victims were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen by circumstance. They happened to be passengers. That was enough. The aircraft itself was part of the changing world of post-war Canada. Commercial aviation was opening possibilities that earlier generations had never experienced. Journeys that once demanded long hours by train or ship could now be completed much faster by air. People were learning to trust aircraft. Airports were becoming gateways between communities. A passenger could step into an airplane surrounded by strangers and expect to emerge somewhere else only a few hours later. That trust was essential. Without it, commercial aviation could not function. But trust is fragile. It depends upon a simple belief that the person next to you does not intend to kill you. Nobody searches every passenger for the private motives hidden inside their heart. Nobody can. And nobody could have looked at Albert Gay and immediately recognized the future he was planning. That is why the crime feels so modern despite taking place in 1949. The technology may have been different. The aircraft was different. The airport was different. The communication systems were different. But the psychology of the crime was painfully familiar. A person wants something. He becomes convinced that another person is standing in his way. He stops thinking about consequences. He begins justifying actions that would once have seemed impossible. Then the fantasy becomes a plan. The plan becomes an action. And eventually, the consequences become irreversible. For Gay, the process had been unfolding long before the aircraft left the ground. His relationship with Rita had deteriorated. His attention had shifted toward Marie-Ange Robitaille. The idea of a different life had taken hold. And instead of accepting the painful reality that relationships sometimes end, Gay sought a way to end his marriage without accepting the ordinary consequences of doing so. That is why the insurance policy matters. It was not simply a financial document. It represented preparation. The existence of a financial benefit connected to Rita's death would later become one of the details investigators could not ignore. A grieving husband who loses his wife in a terrible accident is tragic. A husband who loses his wife in an accident and stands to receive money from her death is more complicated. A husband who receives that money while also being involved with another woman becomes more suspicious. And a husband connected to the circumstances surrounding an explosion becomes something else entirely. But on the morning of the flight, those connections had not yet been made. They were still scattered pieces. Nobody looking at the airport that morning could see the complete picture. The people around Gay saw fragments. Someone knew about his marriage. Someone knew about his affair. Someone knew about the package. Someone knew about the device. Someone knew about the insurance. But the entire story existed inside Gay's mind. He was the only person who understood how all the pieces were supposed to fit together. That gave him confidence. It also created his vulnerability, because the more complicated the plan became, the more people had to participate, and every participant created another point of failure. Genero Roost was one. Marguerite Petra was another. Neither of them was supposed to understand everything. That was how Gay protected himself. He could give each person only the information necessary to make them useful. The fewer people who knew the whole plan, the safer he believed himself to be. It is a common strategy in conspiracies. Divide the truth. Give one person one piece. Give another person another. Keep the center hidden. But human beings are not machines. They remember conversations. They become frightened. They ask questions. They compare stories. And when investigators arrive, those fragments can be reconstructed. That was what would happen here. But first came the journey. The morning of September 9th had begun without drama. The aircraft was preparing for its scheduled route. Passengers were making their way through the ordinary stages of travel. There was nothing visibly sinister about the process. That is perhaps the most haunting image of the entire case. The airplane did not look like a weapon. It looked like an airplane. The passengers did not look like victims. They looked like travelers. The crew did not look like people about to become part of a famous murder case. They looked like professionals preparing to perform another routine flight. Nobody could see the future. Nobody could see the investigation that would follow. Nobody could see the courtroom. Nobody could see the prison. Nobody could see the gallows. Nobody could see the years of newspaper headlines that would keep the case alive. All of that existed only in the future. For the passengers, the future still belonged to them. They had plans. That simple fact deserves attention. Every person who boards an airplane assumes that the future belongs to them. A person does not board thinking about the final moment of their life. They think about what happens after arrival. A meeting. A family visit. A business appointment. A meal. A conversation. A return home. Those plans are invisible to everyone else, but they are what make a life feel real. The people aboard Flight 108 had them too. And then there was Rita. Her presence gave Gway's private conflict a place inside the larger tragedy. Without Rita, the bombing would not have happened in the way it did. She was the reason Gay chose this particular method. Yet the irony is that the people around her paid the price. The airplane did not contain only Rita. It contained strangers. And the bomb did not know the difference. That distinction between intended victim and actual victims would become central to the moral horror of the case. Gay may have imagined he was solving a personal problem, but once the bomb was placed aboard Flight 108, he had crossed far beyond the boundaries of his marriage. He had made a decision about the lives of people he had never met. He had effectively decided that their lives were expendable. There was no consent, no warning, no chance to escape, no opportunity for the passengers to understand what was happening. That is what makes the crime different from a private act of violence. The victims were trapped inside Gway's decision, and the aircraft itself became the mechanism. The journey from Montreal toward Quebec and onward toward Baie-Comeau should have been routine. Instead, it became the final journey of 23 people. The flight schedule would later become an important part of the investigation because Gay had relied on timing. He wanted the bomb to explode at a particular stage of the journey. He believed the aircraft would be over the St. Lawrence River. That detail reveals how much planning had gone into the crime. He was not merely hoping for an explosion. He was trying to determine where the bodies would fall. He was trying to control the physical evidence after the murders. In other words, Gay was already thinking beyond the deaths. He was thinking about the investigation. That suggests something important about his state of mind. He knew that what he was doing was wrong. A person does not need to plan how to conceal evidence unless he understands that the truth would condemn him. Gway's plan depended on secrecy. He understood that if the authorities discovered the bomb, the story would become very different. He needed an accident. He needed confusion. He needed wreckage scattered over a large area. And above all, he needed the river. Water was supposed to erase the physical story, but the river would not receive the aircraft. The delay changed everything. This small interruption in the flight schedule became the invisible force that destroyed Gui's carefully calculated plan. The aircraft was not where he expected it to be when the timer reached its appointed moment. The explosion occurred while the plane was still near land, and the aircraft came down at Saltocoshone. That location would become one of the most important places in the investigation, because the ground preserved what the river might have hidden. The investigators could reach the wreckage. They could collect fragments. They could examine the damage. They could search for evidence. And the bomb itself, rather than disappearing beneath the water, became part of the physical story. Guy had tried to use an airplane to erase his crime. The airplane became the evidence of his crime. There is a terrible irony in that. The same machine he believed would protect him became the witness against him. The same explosion he believed would end the story began the investigation. The same death he believed would set him free became the beginning of his downfall. But none of this was known yet. The passengers were still alive. The aircraft was still flying. And the clock was still counting. This is where the atmosphere of the story becomes almost unbearable, because the audience knows what is coming. The passengers do not. We know the aircraft will never arrive. They do not. We know Rita will never return. She does not. We know Guy is waiting for the explosion. The passengers have no idea anyone is waiting for them to die. That difference creates a terrible silence around every moment before the disaster. The aircraft continues through the sky. The countryside moves beneath it. The passengers continue their private thoughts. And inside the aircraft, time continues to pass. The bomb does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to announce itself. It simply waits. The same way a clock waits. The same way a fuse waits. The same way a decision waits for its consequence. Then the appointed moment approaches. Gui's plan is about to collide with reality. And reality has already changed the conditions. The flight is late. The aircraft is not over the water. The location is wrong. But the timer does not know that. It cannot adapt. It cannot understand that the plan has failed. It can only reach the moment it was designed to reach. That is what makes the next few minutes so important. The fate of 23 people has been reduced to a mechanical sequence, not because their lives were unimportant, but because one man decided they were. The airplane continues. The passengers remain unaware. The crew continue doing their work, and the land below becomes the place where the consequences will arrive. Then the explosion comes. There is no warning that could save them. No time for anyone outside the aircraft to intervene. The DC-3 is violently destroyed. The journey ends in an instant. The morning that began with routine becomes catastrophe, and the quiet landscape of Saltocoshone receives the wreckage. For the families of the victims, there will soon be another journey. A journey to hospitals, officials, police stations, morgues, and eventually graves. For investigators, another journey begins. A journey backward. They will trace the flight. They will examine the wreckage. They will identify the victims. They will search for the cause. And eventually, they will ask about Rita. Then they will ask about her husband. That is where the ordinary world of Quebec will collide with the hidden world Albert Guy had constructed. The man who had appeared to be an ordinary businessman will become the central figure in a case that shocked the country. But before that happens, the investigators must understand the people who died, because the crime scene is not merely a place where bodies are found. It is the final location of human stories. The belongings scattered across the wreckage are not just evidence. They are remnants of lives. A personal object can reveal that someone was there only minutes earlier. A piece of luggage can tell investigators where someone was sitting. A name on a document can turn an anonymous victim into a person. And as those identities emerge, the scale of what Guy has done becomes harder to ignore. 23. Not one. 23. One man's desire has multiplied into 23 deaths, and that number will follow the investigation all the way to the courtroom. It will follow Gay to prison. It will follow him to the gallows, and it will remain long after he is gone, because the explosion did not simply destroy an airplane. It destroyed the assumption that ordinary people could board a commercial flight without fearing that another person's private obsession might become their death sentence. Flight 108 would become a warning about what happens when trust is exploited. It would become a lesson in how investigators reconstruct a crime from fragments. And it would become a story about how a seemingly ordinary man can conceal an extraordinary capacity for destruction. But at this stage, the investigators did not know the entire story. They had only the beginning, the wreckage, the dead, the dynamite, the strange circumstances, and the name of a husband whose private life was about to be examined in a way he could never have anticipated. Albert Gay had believed that his wife's death would close one chapter of his life. Instead, it opened the darkest chapter of all. The investigation was coming, and when it arrived, the world he had built around himself would begin to collapse, piece by piece. There are crimes that begin in darkness, and there are crimes that begin in broad daylight. Albert Gay's crime began in the second kind of world. He did not need a hidden laboratory. He did not need a secret organization. He did not need a remote mountain or an abandoned warehouse. He lived among people. He worked among people. He spoke to people. He bought things from people. He sold things to people. And while everyone around him continued with the ordinary business of living, Gay was quietly transforming the problems of his private life into a plan that would eventually kill 23 human beings. That contrast is important, because if we imagine a murderer as someone who exists outside society, someone visibly different from everyone else, we miss one of the most frightening truths about this case. Albert Gay did not have to leave ordinary society to commit an extraordinary crime. He used ordinary society as the machinery of his crime. He used relationships. He used trust. He used a business transaction. He used an insurance policy. He used an aircraft. He used other people's willingness to help. And he used the assumption that an ordinary-looking man could not possibly be planning something so terrible. Quebec in 1949 was a place where reputation mattered. A man's name could follow him through his business, his family, his neighborhood, and his social relationships. People noticed things. They noticed when someone married. They noticed when a marriage became troubled. They noticed when a man began spending time with another woman. But noticing is not the same as understanding. Someone might know that Albert Gay was unhappy. Someone might know that he was involved with Marie-Ange Robitaille. Someone might know that he and Rita had problems. But knowing those things did not mean anyone could imagine the conclusion Gay had reached. There is an enormous psychological distance between saying, "My marriage is failing," and saying, "My wife must die." Most people never cross that distance. Gay did. And once he crossed it, ordinary obstacles began to look different. A legal separation was no longer a solution. A difficult conversation was no longer a solution. Walking away was no longer a solution. Rita had become something he believed had to be removed. That is how an individual can begin constructing a private reality in which an unthinkable action starts to feel reasonable. The outside world still sees the rules. The person inside that private reality begins to see exceptions. Gay wanted another woman. He wanted money. He wanted freedom. And he wanted all three, without having to accept the ordinary consequences. There was, however, a contradiction at the center of his fantasy. He wanted to begin a new life with Marie-Ange Robitaille, but that new life could not exist if people discovered that he had murdered Rita. So he needed to create a death that would not look like murder. That requirement shaped everything that followed. A direct killing would be dangerous. A staged accident might work, but an accident involving only Rita could still attract attention. A plane crash was different. An airplane carried many people. A crash could kill everyone. And if the aircraft disappeared over the St. Lawrence River, investigators might never be able to reconstruct the exact cause. Gay was thinking not only about killing Rita, he was thinking about what investigators would see afterward. That is an important distinction. He was planning the crime and the cover story simultaneously. The cover story was supposed to be simple. An airplane crashes. People die. The tragedy is explained by mechanical failure or some other accident. Families mourn. The investigation eventually ends. The husband collects the insurance. And life moves forward. That was the world Gay thought he could control. But there was another part of the plan he could not control. Other people. The first was General Roost. Roost possessed the technical ability Gay needed. The bomb required more than dynamite thrown into a suitcase. There had to be a mechanism capable of delaying the explosion. There had to be some way to make the device wait until the aircraft was in the desired location. That meant planning. It meant knowledge. It meant construction. And it meant trusting another human being. Gay could conceal the ultimate purpose. He could present the task as something else. But he could not build the device without involving Roost. Then came Marguerite Petra. She became another link. She was asked to transport the package to the airport. From the outside, it was an ordinary act. A person carrying a package. Nothing about that action would necessarily attract attention. And that is precisely why it worked. Gay's conspiracy moved through ordinary behavior. There was no dramatic entrance. No obvious criminal signal. The package simply moved from one set of hands to another. That is how many dangerous conspiracies survive. They do not look dangerous while they are happening. The people involved may not see the entire picture. One person knows one piece. Another knows another. And the person at the center keeps the full design inside his own head. Gay believed that was enough. He believed he could control what each person knew. He believed he could control what the investigators would discover. He believed he could control where the aircraft would fall. He believed he could control what happened after Rita died. In reality, he controlled almost none of it. The most obvious example was the flight schedule. The plan depended on timing. Gay wanted the aircraft over the St. Lawrence River when the bomb exploded. The river was not just scenery. It was supposed to be the final accomplice. Water could conceal. Water could scatter. Water could destroy. If the aircraft disappeared into the river, the physical evidence might become almost impossible to reconstruct. That was what Gay wanted. But the flight did not proceed exactly as expected. There was a delay. A few minutes. Nothing that would normally be remembered. Passengers might have been impatient. Someone might have looked at a watch. Someone might have wondered when the aircraft would finally depart. And then the delay was over. The aircraft left the ground. The passengers settled in. The flight began. But those few minutes had already changed the geometry of the murder. The airplane was now moving through a different position in space. When the timer reached the moment Gay had selected, that small deviation would later become one of the most important details in the entire investigation, because the bomb did not explode over the water. It exploded while the aircraft was still near land, and when the aircraft fell, it came down at Salto Cochon. The difference between water and land was the difference between evidence disappearing and evidence remaining. Gay had built his plan around concealment. The crash site gave investigators access. The Earth became the witness he had never expected. The first responders and investigators who approached the wreckage did not see the elegant plan Gay had imagined. They saw destruction. The airplane was no longer recognizable as a normal passenger aircraft in the way it had been before departure. The ground was covered with the remains of the machine and the people who had been inside it. Personal belongings were mixed with debris. Objects that had been carried for completely ordinary reasons had become pieces of an investigation. The investigators had to look at the wreckage, not as a tragedy alone, but as a puzzle. What had caused the aircraft to break apart? Was there evidence of a mechanical failure? Was there something wrong with the aircraft before takeoff? Had the pilot made an error? Had weather played a role? Every possibility had to be considered. But then the evidence pointed towards something far more disturbing: dynamite. The discovery changed the nature of the investigation immediately. The aircraft had not simply failed. Someone had brought an explosive aboard. Someone had wanted the aircraft destroyed. Someone had wanted everyone aboard it dead. And now the investigators had to work backward. Who could have done it? How had the explosive entered the aircraft? Who had access to the package? Who had a motive? The passenger list became important. So did the relationships of the victims. And when investigators began examining Rita Guay's life, they found a story that demanded attention. Her husband was not merely a grieving spouse. He was a man who had reasons to benefit from her death. He was connected to an insurance policy. He was involved with another woman. And his marriage had deteriorated. Each fact, taken alone, might have been explained. Together, they formed a pattern. That pattern was not yet proof, but it was enough to make Albert Gay important. And once a person's name becomes important in a murder investigation, ordinary details begin to look different. Investigators start asking questions. Where was he? What did he know? Who had he spoken to? Who had he contacted? What had he purchased? Who had helped him? What had he told other people? What did he stand to gain? The private world Gay had tried to separate from his public life was beginning to merge. The businessman and the husband were no longer two separate identities. They were becoming one person in the eyes of investigators. The same man who sold watches and jewelry had a troubled marriage. The same man who wanted another woman had arranged insurance connected to Rita. The same man whose wife died aboard a plane had connections to people who had handled the explosive device. The coincidences were becoming difficult to explain, but Gay still had an advantage. He was alive. Rita was dead. She could not contradict his story. The other passengers were dead. They could not describe what had happened. The crew was dead. They could not tell investigators what they had seen. Gay had survived outside the physical scene of the crime, and survival gave him something invaluable: the ability to tell a story. A murderer can sometimes defeat physical evidence with a convincing narrative. If investigators cannot prove the connection, suspicion remains suspicion. Gay understood that, or at least he understood enough to try to protect himself. He could present himself as a husband who had lost his wife in a terrible accident. He could show grief. He could speak about Rita. He could appear shocked by the disaster. He could allow other people to see him as one of the victims of the tragedy. But there was one problem. The investigation was no longer focused only on the crash. It was focused on the people surrounding the crash. And Gay had left too many connections behind. One of the most important was Marie-Ange. She represented the future he had wanted, but she also represented motive. If investigators could establish the nature of their relationship, they could understand why Rita's death mattered so much to Gay. Love, however, is complicated. An affair can produce jealousy. It can produce anger. It can produce fantasies about escape, but it does not automatically prove murder. Investigators needed more. They needed to know whether Gay had taken concrete steps. The insurance policy was one such step. The explosive was another. The people connected to the device were another. And then there was the question of the package. Someone had carried it. Someone had delivered it. Someone had arranged for it to be aboard the aircraft. That chain was becoming the bridge between Guay's motive and the physical evidence. And that bridge was dangerous, because the moment investigators could connect Gay to the package, the case would stop being a collection of suspicious circumstances. It would become a conspiracy. The investigators were beginning to move from the question of why to the question of how. How had Gay arranged the bomb? How had he obtained the device? How had it reached the airport? Who had helped? Who knew? Who had been deceived? Those questions would eventually lead them to Roost and Petra, but the investigation did not unfold in a straight line. People were afraid. People had incomplete information. People had their own reasons for protecting themselves. And Gay had every reason to make sure nobody could tell the entire truth. This was where the psychological battle began. The police were trying to reconstruct a sequence that Gay had designed to leave no clear sequence at all. Gay wanted the events to look random. The investigators wanted to show that they were connected. Gay wanted an accident. The investigators were looking for intention. Gay wanted Rita's death to disappear into the deaths of 22 strangers. The investigators were beginning to separate Rita from the other victims, not because her life mattered more than theirs, but because her relationship with the suspect could provide the key to understanding the entire tragedy. That distinction is important. The investigators were not simply asking, why was Rita killed? They were asking, why did 23 people die? And the answer appeared to begin with one man's desire to remove his wife. The scale of the crime was therefore larger than the original intention. Gay had created a method that could not stop at his chosen victim. Once the bomb was aboard the aircraft, every passenger became vulnerable. Every crew member became vulnerable. The entire aircraft became a target. That was the point of no return. There was no longer a way to kill only Rita. There was no longer a way to guarantee that the explosion would affect exactly the person Gay wanted. The bomb did not understand his intentions. It only understood the mechanism he had created. And when it detonated, the consequences became irreversible. 23 people died. The private problem Gay had wanted to solve had become a national scandal. The investigators had a crime unlike anything they had expected. The public had a mystery. Families had grief. And Gay had a problem that was growing by the hour. The explosion had failed to erase the evidence. The crash site had preserved clues. The insurance policy pointed toward motive. His affair pointed toward motive. The package pointed toward method. And the people who had helped him were still alive. That last fact was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Gay had built his plan on the assumption that he could control people. But people cannot always be controlled after a crime. Fear changes people. Guilt changes people. Interrogation changes people. And when someone realizes that the person who recruited them may have used them as a shield, loyalty can disappear very quickly. Gay would soon discover that. But for the moment, the investigation was still assembling its case. There was no dramatic confrontation yet. No courtroom. No confession. No final verdict. Only questions. Questions that investigators would ask again and again. Questions that would gradually narrow the circle around Albert Gay. And as that circle tightened, the world he thought he controlled would become smaller. First, the airplane was gone. Then the cover story began to fail. Then the evidence survived. Then the names of the people connected to the bomb began to emerge. And eventually, the man who had believed he could hide behind an accident would find himself standing directly in front of the consequences of his own plan. The most disturbing part was that none of this required extraordinary luck. It required only the ordinary weaknesses of a human conspiracy. A person remembers. A person talks. A person becomes frightened. A person makes a mistake. A schedule changes. A piece of evidence survives. A lie contradicts another lie. And slowly, the invisible becomes visible. That was what was beginning to happen around Flight 108. The wreckage was speaking. The insurance policy was speaking. The relationships were speaking. The package was speaking. And soon, the people themselves would begin to speak. Albert Gay had imagined that the explosion would silence everyone. Instead, it created a chorus of questions. Who built the bomb? Who delivered it? Who knew? Who lied? Who paid? Who stood to gain? And above all, who had wanted Rita Gay dead badly enough to sacrifice 22 strangers with her? The answer was becoming clearer. But clarity would not come all at once. It would come piece by piece. A name here. A statement there. A contradiction. A frightened witness. A document. A conversation remembered after the fact. And eventually, one decisive connection that would pull the entire conspiracy into the light. For now, though, Albert Gay was still at the center of a world he believed he could control. He had wanted to write the ending himself. He had wanted Rita gone. He had wanted the insurance money. He had wanted Marie-Ange. He had wanted the river to swallow the evidence. But the river never received the airplane. The evidence remained. The investigation began. And the world Gay had built inside his own mind was about to collide with the world outside it. A world governed not by his desires, but by evidence, by witnesses, by memory, by consequence, and eventually by justice. The morning had begun with an airplane leaving the ground. It ended with 23 people dead and a mystery waiting to be solved. But the real question was no longer whether Flight 108 had been destroyed deliberately. That was becoming clear. The real question was how far Albert Gay had gone to make sure it happened. And the answer would reveal that the explosion at Salto Cochon was only the visible end of a conspiracy that had begun much earlier, in the quiet and ordinary life of a man who believed that killing his wife was the easiest way to become free. Before Rita Gay became a name in a police file, before her photograph could be placed beside the names of the other victims of Flight 108, before investigators would examine the circumstances surrounding her death and discover the dark secret hidden inside her marriage, she was simply a woman living her life. She had no idea that her husband was planning to kill her. She had no idea that another woman had become the center of his attention. She had no idea that money had been placed between her life and her husband's future. And most importantly, she had no idea that the journey she was about to take would become the final journey of her life. That is where Rita's story must begin. Not with the explosion, not with the wreckage, not with the investigation, but with the simple fact that she was alive. Because in the years that followed, it would have been easy for Rita to become nothing more than the wife of Albert Gay, the woman whose death exposed one of the most notorious murder conspiracies in Canadian history. But she was more than that. She was a person with a life that existed independently of the man who eventually destroyed it. She had a home. She had relationships. She had a history. She had expectations about tomorrow. And like almost everyone else in the world, she probably assumed that tomorrow would arrive. That assumption is one of the quiet foundations of human life. We make plans because we expect to continue living. We buy things because we expect to use them. We make appointments because we expect to keep them. We say goodbye because we expect to meet again. We board airplanes because we expect to land. Rita had that same expectation. There was nothing about her morning that could have told her otherwise. Somewhere behind the ordinary movements of that day, however, Albert Gay was living in a completely different reality. He had already crossed a line that Rita could not see. To her, he was still her husband. To him, she had become an obstacle. That transformation is difficult to comprehend. Marriage creates an expectation of protection. The person sleeping beside you is supposed to be someone you can trust. The person who knows your habits, your fears, your routines, and your vulnerabilities is supposed to be the person least likely to exploit them. Yet Gay had done exactly that. He knew Rita's life because he was part of it. He knew enough about her circumstances to understand how her death could be arranged. He knew enough about their relationship to know that suspicion might eventually fall upon him. And he knew enough about the world around him to understand that a conventional murder would be dangerous. So he searched for another solution. The solution was an airplane. That decision tells us something profound about the distance Gay had created between himself and Rita. If he had killed her face to face, he would have been forced to confront her as a human being. He would have had to see her fear. He would have had to hear her voice. He would have had to physically perform the act he had imagined. Instead, he chose a method that could create distance. The bomb would do the killing. The aircraft would carry it. The explosion would erase the evidence. And Gay could remain somewhere else, separated from the final moment by distance, machinery, and time. That distance may have made the murder easier for him to contemplate, but it did not make Rita's death any less personal. In fact, The personal nature of the motive was what made the tragedy so disturbing. She was not killed because she had attacked him. She was not killed because she was a political enemy. She was not killed because of some dispute that had suddenly turned violent. She was killed because her husband wanted a different life. And in that imagined future, there was no place for her. Gay wanted Marie-Ange Robitaille. He wanted the marriage he already had to disappear. He wanted financial benefit from Rita's death. He wanted freedom without having to go through the consequences of obtaining it honestly. That combination created the motive that would eventually bring investigators to him. But Rita could not see any of it. That is what makes the story so painful. The victim was living inside the very world that the murderer was secretly dismantling. Perhaps there were arguments. Perhaps there were moments of tension. Perhaps Rita knew that her marriage was failing. But even if she understood that her husband was unhappy, there is an enormous difference between knowing a marriage is broken and knowing that the other person has decided you should die. A troubled marriage can be survived. A divorce can be survived. Heartbreak can be survived. Humiliation can be survived. But murder removes every possibility of repair. Rita would never get the chance to decide what came next. She would never get the chance to leave. She would never get the chance to confront Gay with what he had done. She would never get the chance to ask him why. The bomb took all of those possibilities away. And because the bomb was placed aboard a passenger aircraft, it took them away from 22 other people as well. That is where Rita's individual tragedy